This little car is a big deal. It's a big deal for several reasons. The first reason is that it has been more than 20 years since Toyota has done something like this. Hell, it's been more than 20 years since anybody has done something like this. It hasn't been since the 90s that we got a true homologation car, one that differs from the regular car by more than a few stickers. So it's no wonder that pretty much every car enthusiast out there is pretty excited.
This is a beast.
Oh, that was good.
Oh, yes. Wow.
The second reason why this little car is a big deal is, as fanboys have already told us many times,
this is not a Toyota, it's a BMW. And this is not a Toyota, it's a Subaru.
Yeah, we know, the extremely repetitive nature of these arguments has made them beyond annoying. But it's also kinda hard to argue against them because this really does have a lot of BMW in it. And this also has a lot of Subaru in it as well. But this doesn't. It's virgin Toyota metal and carbon fiber, untouched by the filthy hands of non-Scotty Kilmer approved brands. Now the third reason why this car is a big deal is that it has passion for performance in its DNA. Passion and emotion is something that many have argued Toyota's products have been lacking in the past decade or so. And this is something that Akio Toyoda, the president of Toyota and grandson of Kiichiro Toyoda, the founder of Toyota, got sick of hearing. He got so sick of hearing this that he himself sat behind the steering wheel of every single test mule of the GR Yaris. And together with four-time WRC champion and soon-to-be ex-boss of Toyota's WRC department, the legend Tommi Mäkinen, they tuned the GR Yaris until they were completely satisfied with it. But today I'm not going to talk to you about the carbon roof or the suspension or the very impressive all-wheel drive system of the new Yaris GR. I'm not doing that because these topics have already been extensively covered by hundreds of articles and videos. Today I want to add value and talk about the other extremely interesting aspect of this car. And that, of course, is the engine. Now, if you research the Yaris GR, when it comes to the engine, you're going to get usually pretty scarce info. They're going to give you some horsepower and torque figures, the 0 to 60 time. They're going to tell you it's a 1.6 inline 3 that's turbocharged, and you're going to get maybe one or two additional interesting details, and that's going to be pretty much it. Usually one paragraph or even half a paragraph for the engine. And if you ask me, that isn't enough. But today we're going to fix that, because today I want to make probably the most comprehensive video currently available on this engine. So sit back, relax, and get ready for a trip deep into the engine of the new Yaris GR. Okay, let's start with the basics, and the basics are this thumbnail. As you can see on the thumbnail, we have the world's most powerful inline 3 engine written. And these are pretty big words, right? Well, they are true. The engine in the new Yaris GR is the world's most powerful production inline 3-cylinder engine. The key word here being production. This engine beat the previous most powerful production inline 3-cylinder engine, the one in the BMW i8. Also, with 167.5 horsepower per liter, it also beat Toyota's record for its highest ever specific output engine. Toyota's record for horsepower per liter of displacement has, embarrassingly enough, been standing since 2004. It was held for 16 years by an MPV. This is the Caldina GT4, and inside it, it had the 2-liter inline 4 Toyota 3S GTE turbocharged engine, and it made 256 horsepower. Now, some of you might also jump the gun and say, what about the Koengisegg Gemera? It has a 2-liter inline 3-cylinder engine with 600 horsepower. It also has free valve. Do you know about free valve? It has free valve. There's no cam, it has free valve. Yeah, we know about free valve. Now, before you jump the gun with the Gemera, I'd like to politely direct you to the Gemera's Wikipedia page. On the right side of that Wikipedia page, there is a year. And as you can see clearly, that year is in the future. Now, production of the Gemera and delivery of the cars has not started yet. This is why, thanks to this fact, the engine in the new Yaris GR is on this day today, which is the 20th of October 2020, the world's most powerful production inline 3-cylinder engine. But honestly, even if the Gemera was being produced and delivered, and if we were in the future, I think we could still call the YARIS GR engine the most powerful production inline 3-cylinder engine, because calling the Gemera and its engine production is a bit of a stretch. They're only going to make 300 of these cars, and the only people that can afford them are guys with multiple wives. So in all honesty, I kind of find it hard to get excited about cars like this. On the other hand, a regular person with a job can go into the nearest Toyota dealership and say, I'd like one of these, please and thank you. Now let's see what a 268 horsepower in the new G16E-GTS engine actually comes from. And we're starting with the engine block, the core of the engine. The engine block in the new YARIS GR engine is cast aluminum open deck design, like with many other modern engines. We also have cast iron liners, which are extremely thin, and they're fused into the block by having the block cast around the liner. In fact, the liners are so thin that you can forget about overboring the block and installing oversized pistons. This is actually something that you can find on many other modern recent engines, and many manufacturers claim that they're doing this to save weight. I honestly kind of find it hard to understand how a few millimeters of cylinder liner saves weight. I think this is done to reduce cost because it saves the manufacturer from having to produce and stock oversized pistons as well. So this means that if your engine goes kaboom, you're not going to be machining anything. Instead, you're going to go to Toyota and buy a whole new engine block. I'm pretty sure the engine remanufacturing industry isn't happy about this, but it is what it is, and we can see this on many other modern engines. A really nice feature of the engine block is that it's a very rigid three-piece design. All of the main bearings comprise a single unit, so we have a main bearing girdle. This is always a good thing on an engine because it improves rigidity and prevents distortion during high engine loads. The bearings themselves are made from an aluminum alloy with an additional anti-friction metal layer, and we have a polymer coating on the thrust washer. Underneath the main bearing girdle, we can find the oil pan element. This too is another structural element which further improves the rigidity of the block. Inside the oil pan element, we also have an incorporated baffle. So all in all, despite the open deck design, we seem to have a very rigid block. As with most inline 3-cylinder engines, we have 120 degrees of separation between individual crank throws. This gives us an even firing interval and good overall balance. The crankshaft is, like most Toyota crankshafts, forged steel, and it's induction hardened. The connecting rods are also forged steel. As we have learned in the previous week's video, inline 3-cylinder engines experience a rocking moment due to their uneven number of pistons. In other words, they rock from back to front and front to back due to the inequality of forces in relation to their center of gravity. To balance this out, Toyota decided to use a balancing shaft. The balancing shaft is directly driven by a gear on the crankshaft, and it's bolted to the block using its own separate housing. Just like with many other modern engines and all the engines in Toyota's dynamic force range, the crankshaft centerline has been offset from the cylinder centerline. This results in a more direct transfer of forces through the major thrust axis of the piston. It also reduces friction between the piston rings and the cylinder, and these things help both power and efficiency. When it comes to the pistons, we have aluminum T-shaped pistons with a very thin inner wall structure. Now, I couldn't find, unfortunately, verifiable concrete info on whether they are cast or forged pistons, but I'm pretty sure they're hypereutectic cast pistons, which means you get minimal clearance and minimal cold start blow-by. After all, this is a Euro 6 emissions norm engine, and passing a Euro 6 emissions test in this vehicle category with forged pistons is almost impossible. A lot of effort has been made to make these pistons very low friction and to give them strong ring glands. In the topmost compression ring gland, we have a cast iron resist insert, and the edges of the rings are actually coated with DLC, a diamond-like coating. When it comes to the skirt and the crown, both of them have been shot peened, after which the skirts have received a resin coating. Another very interesting feature of the YARIS GR engine is the oil squirters, and this engine has, wait for it, 9 of them. Yes, that's 3 oil squirters per single piston. Now, a lot of people still say that piston oil squirters are bad for your engine. They reduce your oil pressure. You should get rid of them. All the drag racing guys, they delete their oil squirters and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of people have graduated past this way of thinking, but you can still hear this occasionally being said. Well, here's the definitive proof that oil squirters will not reduce your engine oil pressure in a way that can damage your engine, because if 9 of them will not harm an inline 3-cylinder engine, then nothing will. And people used to say these things, the negative things about piston oil squirters for engines that have 1 oil squirter per piston. The reality is that oil squirters have a check valve on them. They only open when oil pressure reaches a certain point. At low RPMs and low oil pressure, they're not spraying any oil, so they're not taking away any oil pressure from your engine. They activate only at a certain RPM when oil pressure is high enough, and at this point, spraying away some of the oil pressure will not hurt your engine because the oil pressure is already more than high enough. And this is why pretty much every modern turbocharged engine has piston oil squirters on them. But still, the drag racing guys delete them, right? Well, they can delete them because their engine is fully loaded up for like 10 seconds. If you want to go circuit racing and then you delete your oil squirters, I'm gonna bet that your engine is going to start knocking at some point, and then your ECU is going to retard your timing, and then you're going to make like 30 to 40% less power, and nobody wants that, of course. This engine in the Yaris GR is a turbocharged engine with a 10.5 to 1 compression ratio. This is a compression ratio that used to be considered high for a naturally aspirated engine around 10 years ago. So this compression ratio answers why you need so many piston oil squirters. At this sort of compression ratio, you really want to prevent knock, and you want to keep the pistons as cool as possible. And a great way to do that is to spray a tsunami of engine oil to the underside of the piston. And this explains why the underside of the block of this engine looks like a garden irrigation system. Now we're moving on to the cylinder head, where things are going to get even more interesting. When it comes to the basic anatomy of the cylinder head, we of course have 4 valves per cylinder, giving us a total of 12 valves. The camshafts ride on 4 journals each, and in a fashion a bit uncharacteristic of past Toyota designs, even the lower half of the journal can be separated from the head. When it comes to the camshafts themselves, we have something that used to be reserved for all-out racing engines only, but we see it more and more on mass-produced engines, and that's that the camshafts are actually hollow tubes, and cam lobes are attached to these hollow tubes. This makes, of course, the camshafts a lot lighter, which significantly reduces parasitic losses in the valve train. The rest of the valve train is composed of hydraulic valve lifters and rocker arms. Toyota describes the Yaris GR engine as having very large performance-oriented exhaust valves. Unfortunately, I couldn't find concrete verifiable info on what's the actual exhaust valve diameter, but I'm pretty sure that the very healthy bore size of 87.5 millimeters is going to allow some pretty big exhaust valves. Also, like on any serious turbocharged engine, the exhaust valves are hollow and sodium filled to maximize cooling. Now we're going to take a look at the intake port design and the overall encoded valve angle of the Yaris GR engine, something that this engine shares with every other engine in the dynamic force range, and something that I'm personally a big fan of. Now, for starters, Toyota did something pretty unconventional with the valve encoded angle. That's the angle between your intake and your exhaust valves. In the past decade or so, the global trend was to go narrower with the valve encoded angle. This is because a narrow valve encoded angle enables a very straight intake port shape. This, of course, helps airflow and thus power and responsiveness. But Toyota, in their last dynamic force engine range, went wider with the valve encoded angle. And although a wider valve encoded angle does help scavenging, it was avoided in recent designs because it forces the intake port shape to be bent. According to Toyota, the wide valve encoded angle is used to improve the tumbling of the air-fuel mixture. But this also seems to be counterproductive because according to many designs out there, the narrow valve encoded angle should be used to improve the tumbling of the air-fuel mixture. After all, the narrow angle sends the air-fuel mixture at a steeper angle into the combustion chamber, and this should improve the tumbling effect. So Toyota went wider with the goal of doing the opposite. So how does this whole system work? Well, it works thanks to this little ramp that you can see right here at the end of the intake port. Now, somebody familiar with conventional intake port designs and shapes would probably say, you know what, let's grind this away, let's get rid of it, this is wrong. But it's not. It's actually smart. It does some very important things. First of all, this ramp enables the intake port to be extremely straight in shape despite of the wide valve encoded angle. And the second thing that it does is that it fulfills the entire purpose of this whole design. It enables the air to glide across the back of the valve. The goal of this design isn't to get the airflow perpendicular to the back of the valve. It actually wants this gliding across the back of the valve with the goal of preserving the maximum possible air velocity and thus improving the tumbling of the air-fuel mixture. The more we tumble the air-fuel mixture, the better the fuel in this mixture is going to vaporize. The more the fuel vaporizes, the more homogeneous the mixture will be. The more homogeneous the mixture, the better our combustion. We're going to have less emissions and we're going to be making more power, because the more homogeneous the mixture, the faster our combustion speed. And Toyota claims that the engines in the dynamic force range have the fastest combustion speed in the world. When it comes to internal combustion engines, it's impossible to overestimate the importance of the combustion speed, because the faster your combustion, the better. The faster your combustion, the more power you make, the more efficient your engine, the less emissions it's going to make. On top of this, an additional benefit of the wider valve encoded angle is better scavenging, and better scavenging in turn enables better turbocharger efficiency. Now, looking at the intake and exhaust ports like this might make you think that there have been some losses in maximum possible air quantity at the top end of the RPM range, probably somewhere near the red line. And although this might be true, it's likely that the losses are pretty minimal and a small price to be paid for the overall gain in economy, efficiency, as well as responsiveness in the low and mid RPM range, thanks to the preserved air velocity. Also, anyone who has already driven and reviewed the YARIS GR claims that this engine loves to rush to the red line. So it seems that Toyota managed to preserve top end drama while focusing on responsiveness and the low and mid range of the RPM band. Now, the final icing on the cake when it comes to this engine is the CNC machined top section of the intake port that you can see right here. Every intake port is individually CNC machined to ensure an optimal finish and the best possible fitment with the intake manifold. When it comes to the valve timing, we do not have variable valve lift, but we do have variable timing gears driven by a single roller timing chain on both the intake and the exhaust. The intake is equipped with a VVTIW, which stands for Intelligent Wide Variable Valve Timing Gear, and it has a whopping adjustment range of 70 degrees. The exhaust is equipped with a more conventional VVTI timing gear and has 41 degrees of adjustment. The end result of all of this is, of course, better starting, better responsiveness, and more power. Like all dynamic force engines, this one is also equipped with the D4ST fuel injection system, and it consists of both direct and port injection. At low and medium loads, both direct and port injection is used to maximize homogenization, to improve fuel economy and reduce emissions. But at high engine loads, only direct injection is used for maximum injection accuracy and to prevent knocking. I have to say that I do like this system because it gives you both the benefits of direct and indirect or port injection. So you get no carbon buildup, but you also do get the accuracy of direct fuel injection. The downside is, of course, that this has a lot of parts and the potential for increased maintenance and servicing costs. Now let's move on to the turbo. Interestingly enough, the YARIS GR engine shares something with Toyota's previous HP per liter record holder engine, the 4th and 5th generation of the 3S GTE engines, and that is that the turbocharger is integrated into the exhaust manifold. The exhaust manifold is cast together as a single unit with the turbine housing. This means that if you want to replace the turbo, you're going to need to build a custom exhaust manifold for the turbo you want to install on the engine. Unfortunately, I couldn't find verifiable data as to the size of the turbocharger, but what we do know is that it's a single scroll ball bearing turbocharger, which means very fast response, and it's a single scroll because you do not really need a twin scroll on an inline 3-cylinder engine. When it comes to turbocharging, inline 3s are actually better suited to turbocharging than an inline 4. An inline 3-cylinder actually fires every 240 degrees of crankshaft rotation, while an inline 4 fires every 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation. And although this does mean that there's a gap between power strokes in the inline 3, it also means there's greater gap between the individual exhaust pulses of an inline 3-cylinder engine, which means that inside the inline 3 there's zero chances of the exhaust pulses interfering with each other and reducing the efficiency of the turbo. So this, together with the really good scavenging effect created by the wide encoded valve angle and the separation between the exhaust pulses, means overall really good scavenging and significantly improved turbocharger working and efficiency. When it comes to the wastegate actuation, there's no fancy electronics, just a old school pneumatic wastegate actuator. Also, the intake manifold is as expected and according to modern standards, black plastic, and just like pretty much any modern intake manifold, it is of variable length. It has a flap inside which closes for maximum air velocity at low and mid RPM and opens up at higher RPM ranges for maximum air quantity. There's also some interesting things in the coolant department. The cylinder head has a 2-level coolant jacket to improve and increase the flow of the coolant. And also the YARIS GR engine steps away from the rest of the dynamic force engine family in that it has a mechanical water pump. The rest of the dynamic force engines have an electric water pump, which means less parasitic losses because there's less of a belt and less pulleys on an engine with an electric water pump. But I guess your engineers decided that a mechanical water pump would be safer on a car like this, that people are likely to take to a track and drive hard for extended periods of time. And I guess in circumstances like this, the added mechanical safety of a water pump with a pulley driven by the belt is definitely a good idea. Also, we already know that the YARIS GR engine is a champion when it comes to horsepower per liter, but it seems to be an even bigger champion when it comes to radiator size per engine size. Just look at that thing. This giant radiator together with the giant front grille and this very large stepless fan probably means that this engine will never have issues with overheating regardless of where and how you drive it, which isn't something that can be said for the initial production versions of some of its hot hatch competitors. Civic Type R. The final interesting feature of the engine is that it has 3 engine mounts, but the right hand one is hydraulic and it's highly engineered to ensure that none of those inline 3 vibrations and noises actually make it into the cabin. We're going to finish things off by briefly talking about the tuning potential of this engine, because I'm pretty sure sooner rather than later somebody's going to yank this thing out of the Yaris and try to see if they can make 1000 horsepower with an inline 3-cylinder engine. Of course, it has an open deck aluminum block, so this thing is no 2JZ, but I doubt that even the most naive of car enthusiasts were expecting 2JZ-like things from an engine made in 2020. So what does this thing have going for it? Well, it has some good things going for it. First of all, port injection means you can easily add injectors of a larger size without needing to custom fabricate anything like fuel rails or stuff like that. The turbine housing integrated into the exhaust manifold isn't a good thing because it means you need a custom exhaust manifold for your new turbo, but everybody gets custom exhaust manifolds for high builds anyway. And the good thing is that at least the exhaust manifold isn't integrated into the cylinder head like in some other engine designs. The pistons seem to be made for minimal friction and minimal weight at stock power levels. I'm pretty sure they can take a few extra PSI, but probably if you want big power, you're gonna need something forged, of course. Also, the plastic intake manifold is gonna have to go at higher power levels, and although open block decks might seem discouraging for high boost applications, the aftermarket has long since found ways around open deck engine blocks with custom-made block inserts to reinforce the top of the engine block. Also, that giant radiator and intercooler in the front are a good thing, and they seem to leave a lot of room for growth. So all in all, a pretty good package. And although I think that this engine at this power level is really well suited to the car as it is, we're all crazy petrol heads and we start yearning for more power sooner rather than later. And there you have it. That's pretty much it when it comes to the engine in the new YARIS GR. Definitely a very, very cool and interesting engine, and it demonstrates just how far technology has come, because it manages to make almost as much power in stock form as old popular Toyota engines with half the cylinders, almost half the displacement, and half the weight. If that isn't impressive, I don't know what is. This is definitely a very interesting new chapter for Toyota. So from me, and I'm pretty sure most of Toyota's fan base, a big arigato to Akio Toyoda-san, Mr. Makinen, and everybody else who was involved in the creation of this amazing engine and the Yaris GR.